Imagine for a moment that you are standing inside a grand old palace on a quiet morning when something deeply strange begins to unfold. King Charles did something no one expected. From the privacy of his dressing room, he reached for a special emergency stop button connected to the palace computer systems and pressed it. This was no minor glitch. The entire network went dark for hours. While staff members wandered the corridors trying to understand what had gone wrong, the king sat alone and carefully wrote a secret update to his will. The scene feels like something lifted from a film, yet the sequence of events unfolded exactly as described. He employed a piece of hardware constructed decades earlier for genuine emergencies, a physical tool that allowed him to sever his household from the main servers. He wanted no one watching the papers he was about to sign. Those papers altered the distribution of wealth and property within the royal family and carried the potential to reshape its future for generations. On a cold Tuesday morning in late 2025 at Sandringham House, the King's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, sat at a desk lit by a single lamp and opened a heavy leather box. Inside lay a single sheet of thick paper bearing the King's personal cipher. 5 lines of writing appeared at first glance to be nothing more than a routine note concerning a small cottage in Scotland. In reality, the coded language, a form used by royal solicitors for more than a century, instructed the managers of the king's private fortune to freeze every movement of his personal savings. That quiet discovery marked the beginning of the day's extraordinary events. Royal wills have long been sealed for 90 years after the death of a sovereign, so that neither the public nor the tax authorities can examine the true extent of private holdings. What Charles undertook that morning was different. He was not waiting until after his own death. He was amending the disposition of his wealth while still on the throne, an act that would fix the new arrangements before any successor could inherit. The implications were immediate and profound. Only minutes after the king examined the coded sheet, the security systems at Sandringham failed. Every screen on the lower floors went blank, except for a single blinking red light. Technicians tried their passwords and found them useless. The household was locked out of its own network and cut off from the principal offices in London. At first, the staff feared an external attack. The truth emerged roughly 10 minutes later when someone entered the server room and discovered that a manual override switch had been thrown. The switch was located inside the king's private dressing room. Charles had used a physical key manufactured during the Cold War for use in national emergencies. With that key, he had disconnected the entire house from the wider network so that no one in London could monitor the documents he was preparing. The king was so determined to keep his actions private that he resorted to wartime contingency hardware rather than risk electronic surveillance by his own household. While the systems remained dark, the king's personal physician, Michael Dixon, emerged from the private apartments carrying a sealed leather bag. He spoke to no one in the corridor and handed the bag directly to a motorcyclist waiting outside. The courier left without any recorded destination. The palace continued to operate in isolation. Charles was employing emergency protocols to move legal papers across the country without informing even his eldest son. At that same hour, Prince William was at his London residence. His financial staff normally received continuous updates on any significant movement involving the king's private assets. By 11 o'clock that morning, the digital link with Sandringham had gone silent. William telephoned his father's mobile number and reached only a recorded message stating the handset was unavailable. He then called the main switchboard at the house and was told the king was resting and had given instructions that no one, including family, was to disturb him. Advisors in London grew uneasy. If the king were rearranging the inheritance of properties that belonged to him personally rather than to the crown, the carefully planned transition of wealth to the next generation could be disrupted. Balmoral Castle and Sandringham House are private estates valued in the hundreds of millions of pounds. Any unilateral change in their destination risked opening a deep and lasting rift. While William fretted in London, Charles sat in his study at Sandringham, a room lined with green silk and family portraits. Rain streaked the window beside the small table where he worked. An open ledger lay before him. He dipped a pen into black ink and made the final alterations to the disposition of his private fortune. By noon, the motorcycle courier had already left the estate and was traveling toward a solicitor's office in Norwich. The documents he carried would be executed and registered before the day ended. The financial records the king reviewed that morning contained holdings the public had never seen. Portfolios of equities and bonds accumulated over decades and managed by a small group of trustees who met in secrecy in Scotland. Charles was redirecting those assets with a few decisive strokes of the pen. In London, William's legal team convened an emergency meeting in a basement room at the High Court to determine whether the king possessed the legal authority to move such sums away from the line of succession. Their concern was practical. If the private fortune were restructured, William might inherit the throne without the independent means traditionally considered necessary for a sovereign. Tension increased further when a message arrived from a Swiss bank confirming that a substantial quantity of gold, held by the family since 1936, was being transferred. This was no longer a private family discussion. The king was dismantling long-standing financial safeguards and rewriting the rules that had governed the family's private wealth for generations. Back at Sandringham, the staff managed to restore a single analog telephone line. Sir Clive Alderton spoke quietly into the receiver, reporting that the king's security detail had sealed the upper floors. No one was permitted to enter without the express approval of the physicians. Because the doctors were also safeguarding the legal papers, speculation spread through the household. Some wondered whether the king had discovered an earlier memorandum from Queen Elizabeth concerning certain items of jewelry. If that memorandum conflicted with the existing will, rapid amendment would be required. William examined his own records and confirmed that his grandmother had indeed left a provision in 2021. In the event of a serious family crisis, the reigning sovereign was authorized to alter the distribution of personal property without further consultation. Charles was not acting outside the law. He was invoking a contingency clause his mother had created. By doing so, he was formally declaring that such a crisis existed, thereby granting himself unilateral power to reshape the family's private inheritance. The motorcycle courier reached the solicitor's office in Norwich at 1 o'clock. The bag was handed to a waiting lawyer. Verification of the signatures and registration of the instruments required only 4 minutes. Once completed, the changes could not be reversed by any ordinary court. At Sandringham, the rain ceased. The king closed the ledger, set aside his pen, and rose. The house fell silent. Across the Atlantic in California, a copy of the same documents arrived at the residence of Prince Harry a few hours after the network blackout began. An aide in a gray uniform opened the package with a silver letter opener. The papers carried no ornamental royal devices. They were plain commercial instruments. Their contents were unfavorable to Harry. The documents removed financial provisions that had been set aside for him and his children. Most of that support derived from trusts established by his great-grandmother. The palace had previously described those trusts as secure. Page 14 of the new instrument introduced a clause stating that any beneficiary who resided outside the United Kingdom for more than 5 consecutive years forfeited all rights to the funds. The clause was clearly directed at Harry, who had stepped back from royal duties in 2020. The effective date of the residency requirement coincided precisely with his departure. A further provision warned that any legal challenge by Harry would result in the release of detailed records of his private commercial arrangements. The clause functioned as a powerful incentive to remain silent. Harry's London solicitor, Fiona Shackleton, received her own copy and was informed that the king had invoked statutory powers that rendered the decisions final and beyond the reach of ordinary litigation. Shackleton also noted that a well-known diamond and ruby tiara once belonging to Princess Diana had been removed from the list of items destined for Harry's children. The king had redesignated the piece as a gift to the nation rather than personal property, ensuring it would remain in the Tower of London and could never pass to Harry's family. Another clause transferred ownership of a collection of letters Harry had written as a teenager to Prince William. Those letters, stored in a safe at Sandringham, could no longer be quoted or published by Harry without his brother's consent. When Harry received the telephone briefing, he reacted with restraint, instructing his staff to place the papers in a secure place. The independent financial structure he had built since moving to the United States now faced constraints imposed by older instruments still controlled from Britain. In London, the royal legal teams recognized that a fundamental shift had occurred. The household was no longer relying primarily on public relations to manage internal tensions. It was deploying formal legal mechanisms to enforce silence and compliance. By 3 o'clock, the revised documents had been locked in a vault closed to public inspection. Prince William, meanwhile, boarded a helicopter that carried him across the rain-soaked fields of Norfolk. Mid-flight, the pilot received instructions to divert and land at the edge of the Sandringham woods rather than at the usual pad. The change was irregular. When William stepped onto the wet ground, a household official named David Hill met him and explained, with visible discomfort, that the king's physicians had ordered the upper floors closed to everyone, including members of the family. William disregarded the instruction, pushed past, and discovered that the lift had been disabled. He climbed the back stairs only to find the security doors locked. His biometric access had been revoked. Through a small glass panel, he watched Sir Clive Alderton carry a bag marked with a blue tag indicating international transit, most likely to a jurisdiction, such as the Isle of Man, where additional layers of protection applied. Alderton saw William but declined to open the door, instead holding up a written order signed by the king requiring silence. William recognized that any public confrontation at that moment would create a scandal of its own and withdrew to the library. There he studied the relevant statutes and realized that if the private assets were moved into the new structures, he would inherit not unrestricted wealth, but a set of conditional entitlements. He would receive the benefit of the funds only if he adhered to the rules now being put in place. Shortly afterwards, Alderton left the estate by car for a private airfield. The opportunity for family discussion had closed. At 4:03, 3 external witnesses arrived: a judge, a senior cleric, and a historian. Family members are barred by law from witnessing such instruments, so independent persons of standing were required. They observed the king sign the final documents and then affixed their own signatures. William entered the room and made one last attempt to object, claiming that certain items listed belonged to him. Alderton produced an earlier instrument that William had signed years before, granting the sovereign authority to reallocate personal property in the event of material changes within the family. The objection failed. At 20 minutes past 4, King Charles entered, leaning on a cane and without looking at his son. He sat, signed the papers, and left the room in silence once the witnesses had completed their formalities. Later, William received confirmation that 3 principal income-generating files had been placed under new restrictions. Access to those resources would be available to him only upon compliance with detailed conditions. A substantial additional sum had been directed not into private hands, but into a restricted fund dedicated to the restoration of historic buildings such as Windsor Castle, permanently removing the capital from discretionary use. William returned to the helicopter and looked down at the red brick house as it receded. He understood that when his own turn came, he would inherit an institutional framework redesigned by his father to constrain rather than liberate the next generation. The changes executed on that rainy Tuesday would remain binding for a very long time, transforming the private financial architecture of the family from a matter of personal trust into a structure of formal legal control.